Welcome to Mr. Fix-It Live, number 2. Oh, I got a speech jammer thing going on. Today we are talking about electrical homeowning basics. I'm going to tell you basically everything that I know, or at least a semblance of what I know about home electrical. And I just want to clarify that I am not a licensed electrician. So what I am giving you is advice, pointers, the things that I know. But do your own research, get out there, and if you really want to know this type of stuff, get in there and do it. But I'm going to give you the basics. There's a lot of stuff you can do on your own without having to hire an electrician, and it can save you a ton of money. So without further ado, let me go into some of the basics of home electrical. And what I'm talking about is based in the United States only. This is based on the National Electric Code and some of the stuff that I know. So let's get into kind of the basics. So assuming you know nothing about electrical at all, let's figure it out. So the power comes from your utility company, right? From the power company. It comes to your neighborhood. It goes through the power lines, goes through the transformer, and then it comes in a line to your house. Now, the basics of that is it either comes to your house through the air from a power line, across and through what's called a service mast at the top of your house, which is like a big metal pole, and the wire comes in and down to your breaker panel. Or the other alternative is that it can come in from underground. It can be buried, and then it can come up and into your service panel. So 9 times out of 10, if you're having any issues from the service mast back towards, if you look at it linearly, the service mast back towards the utility company, that's their problem. But from the service mast into your house, and as it diverts through all the different circuits of your house, that's your problem as a homeowner. So it can save you a lot of money if you just have a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of know-how as far as how to handle certain basic repairs, changes you want to make, all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about kind of the basics of residential electrical. And I've got a couple notes here, so forgive me because I wrote some stuff down. So I just want to make sure that I cover everything. So residential electrical can be broken down primarily into 2 types of circuits, right? You have a 220 circuit, which is, when I say 220, that means 220 volt circuit. And that is higher power things such as appliance circuits, high appliance draw, like dryers, ovens, maybe like an electrical range, something like that. Something that draws a lot of power. Those are 220 volt circuits. Now, in addition to that, you'll have a 110 volt circuit, or many 110 volt circuits typically in a home, depending on how big your place is. And those are your standard 110 power receptacles. Those are just the typical 3-prong outlet or 2-prong outlet that you see, that you plug your fans in, that you plug your hair dryers, your whatever. Doesn't matter what it is. And also your lighting. So your overhead lighting in your rooms, those are usually on 110 circuits. And those are for smaller draw, household appliances, computers, those things. Excuse me, sorry. So, from there, let's talk about what the difference is between voltage and amperage. So, what you can have, right, is you have volts and amps. And you might have heard some people say in the past that it's not the volts that kill you, it's the amps that kill you, right? When it comes to working with electrical, if you get shocked, if you have high amps, it's going to kill you. If you have high volts, whatever. That's true to a degree, but it's not exactly true. So if you think about volts, the easiest way, I got a little example here. The easiest way to identify the difference between volts and amps, in my opinion, is to kind of compare it to plumbing. So I've got 2 examples here. I've got 2 different pipes, right? You can see the one in my right hand is much bigger than the one in my left hand. And so if we were to put, let's use the smaller one first. If we were to put a little meter here that measured water flowing through the pipe, the force at which the water was flowing through the pipe would be the volts. So if the water was rushing through this pipe very quickly, that would mean it's a high voltage pipe, right? Or the voltage flowing through the pipe would be high. Now, in this example, the bigger example, if water was rushing through this pipe and filling the pipe, this would be considered a high voltage, high amperage pipe because of the volume. So you see how much more water you can fit through this pipe than you could through this pipe, right? So amperage or current can best be defined as the volume of electrons flowing through the pipe. So just to rehash, right? Volts is the water pressure flowing through the pipe. So if the water was going through this pipe, but it was just trickling through, that would mean that it might be a high amperage, low voltage, right? Because it was just trickling through, but the volume is still there. But if it was under pressure, then this would be high voltage, high amperage. If it was trickling through this pipe, the smaller pipe, then it would be a low voltage, low amperage because the volume's not there, if that makes any sense. That is the easiest way for me to kind of identify the difference between volts and amps, is to use plumbing and water as an example. So watts, right? Electrical devices and appliances and stuff are typically defined in how much watts they use. And the watts can be defined as the amps, so the volume of the current, times the volts, so how fast the current is flowing through the pipe. So watts equals volts times amps. In a typical 15 amp household circuit, you have, so a typical household circuit is 110 to 120. It's technically 110. They call it 110 to 120 volt circuit times 15 amps. And you've got whatever that is, 1800 watts. And in that case, so you have 1800 watts worth of power that you can then use to plug in a fan or something, or say you have a lighting circuit that's made up of 75 watt bulbs, right? 75 watts. How many times does that go into 1800? That's how many light bulbs you can have on that circuit before it trips. But you're only going to get about 80% usage out of that in a typical circuit. On a 15 amp circuit, the 10 typical outlets. So this is an example of a 15 amp receptacle that you would see in your house. It's just a typical 3-prong outlet. These are the newer ones that if you're doing any electrical work in your house currently, these are what you're supposed to be using. These are called tamper-resistant receptacles. And you can tell because they say TR on them. That means you can't stick stuff into them. You can't electrocute yourself. And, they're a safety mechanism. These are newer appliances, or these are newer receptacles. You're not really going to see these in old homes. But if you're going to do any replacement work, the new code, the National Electric Code, says you got to use these. So it says TR on there. It's so your kids can't zap themselves. Now, looking into these a little bit closer, you can see on one side, you see there's these bronze terminals, okay? That is what is the hot side. So if you think about electrical as a passage of current, how does it work? Well, in order for electrical to work, it has to flow from point A to point B, right? It has to go through. And in the middle of that would be whatever you're trying to power. Say you had your phone. You had your phone plugged in. Well, in order for your phone to charge, the power has to go from A in through your phone and out to B. That's how electrical works. So in this instance, A would be where the power is coming in. That's the hot side. That's this bronze size here, bronze terminals here. So the power will come into here and out into whatever device is plugged into it, and then back through. And this is the outside. This is these silver terminals you see here. These are the neutral. So bronze is hot, silver is neutral. Now this green screw down here, this is a ground. Now a ground is a safety. Basically, if there's a fluctuation, the ground provides an outlet, right? It's a safety mechanism. In older outlets, in a lot of old stuff you'll see, maybe there's only the 2-prong, right? And you don't have this 3rd prong down at the bottom. The 3rd prong down here is the ground. In an older outlet, you might not have that. But in those cases, the wiring in the house might be wrapped in a metal casing called BX, and that serves as the ground. But you can update to those boxes by grounding the outlet to the metal box. We're not going to get into all that right now, just the basics of bronze is hot, silver is neutral, green is ground. Now, moving on from there, let's talk about the different types of wiring in a typical house outlet, right? So these are 2 different types of wiring. They look very similar. Both are called Romex. And Romex is a insulated wiring like this. The white one is what's called a 14-2, and the yellow one is called a 12-2. This is going to make up the majority of your 110 circuits in your house, and at least on newer homes. It might not look quite like this, but the basics are the same in older wiring. So let me explain to you what these are. So in here, this is a 14-2. So what does that mean? Okay, well, the wires in here, that means they're 14 gauge. And wiring is labeled with 2 numbers. Usually the first number is something like 14, 12, 10, 8, 6, etc. The smaller the number, the higher the gauge of the smaller the gauge of the wire, the higher the number. Meaning, this is 14, it's a pretty thin wire. A 10 gauge wire would be much thicker. A 6 gauge wire would be much thicker than that. So, going back towards the amperage a little bit, about what we were talking about before, the thicker the wire, the higher the amperage that it can go through, right? Because the bigger volume. So this example, as a big pipe, that would mean it's a low gauge wire. It's like a shotgun, right? A 12 gauge shotgun leaves a big hole. A 20 gauge shotgun leaves a little hole. Well, they both leave big holes, but bigger. So, back to this. So, in this instance, we have a black, a white, and a copper. Okay? The black is hot, right? Black goes to bronze. That's hot. White is your neutral. So that's your return. It closes your circuit. And then the ground, which is this copper one, it doesn't have an insulation, insulating cover on it. It's just pure copper. That goes into the green terminal down here. So, just looking at some of the comments real quick. So, Romex wiring is basically an insulated rubber covering wrapped around wire. I've peeled it back in this, I've cut it off here, but it looks like this otherwise. So you cut this out, and then it has this paper in it. This paper is just insulation. So when you're actually installing this into an outlet or to a receptacle box, you have to get rid of this paper because it's a fire hazard. So they don't want any of this paper inside the boxes when you're working on it. So as a 14 gauge wire, I've got a pair of wire strippers here. On a pair of wire strippers, you've got 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. These are common, just any regular pair of wire strippers. So the 14 goes into the 14. You slide it on here, slide it off, and it exposes the wire underneath. Same thing on the other one. So now, if I was wiring up an outlet, I would cut off this little slack here, get rid of that, feed it through a receptacle box, which I have somewhere, and then it would go black to hot, white to silver, ground to green. Black is hot, white is neutral, ground. So, all right. So the basics are there, right? If you look at a breakdown of what gauge wiring can handle what amperage outlets, you're talking about 14 gauge, okay? This is a typical wiring used for standard receptacle outlets of 15 amps. The way you can tell it's a 15 amp is, again, just the 3 prongs and the ground. That's 15. This is a 15 amp outlet. And it's also written right on here, which you may or may not be able to see, but it says 15 amps, 125 volts. That means this is a 15 amp rated, 125 volt receptacle outlet. Now, that's for 15 amps. This is a 12 gauge wire, so it's slightly thicker, so it can handle higher amperage. So this can handle 20 amps. What would I use 20 amps for? Well, your lighting circuits and your bathroom outlets, stuff that has things that draw a little bit more power, like a hair dryer, for example. These are all, your bathroom outlets are supposed to be 20 amp rated wiring, 20 amp rated outlets. So how do I determine whether or not I have a 15 or a 20 amp outlet? Well, this is an example of a 20 amp outlet. Again, it's another 110 volt circuit, but it's just higher amperage. So this, you can see this little side cross thing that sticks out here. That is an example of a 20 amp outlet. So if you look around your house and you see something like something that looks like this, you know that's a 15 amp outlet. If you see something that looks like this, you know it's a 20 amp outlet. Very similar, they're both 110 circuit. You can plug in the same appliances or the same, things into them. One can handle a little bit more power than the other. So if you have maybe a vacuum and you have the option of plugging in one or the other, this one, if your circuits aren't overloaded, will handle it a little bit better than this one. It just depends on how old your wiring and all that stuff is. If you've ever been in a room, for example, where maybe you plug your vacuum in and you have a lamp plugged in and all of a sudden the lights go dim or something, that's an example of a circuit that's on a load and it's reaching its capacity. So there's too much stuff plugged into that circuit that's drawing too much load and it's drawing the lights down. So going back, right, we're going back to the breaker panel. So you have a service line where it comes in and a service mast, or it's buried underground. The wiring will drop down into the service panel, and the panel itself will be rated for a certain amperage depending on your house. It can be rated for 100 amps for a smaller panel, 200 amps for a bigger panel, and up. It depends on how much power your house is, how big your house is. And then you can have sub panels off of that, but we're not going to get into all that. So the power comes into the panel. It goes into these bars that are in the back of your panel. So the power that comes into your house is big. It's big wire. It's big gauge like this. Depending on the amperage of your service, it could be 6 gauge wire. It could be smaller. It could be, depends on how many amps that power is. If you want to update how much power your house can handle, you got to talk to your utility company in order to make sure you have the proper service line that comes in. So you got to deal with them if you want to deal with that. But for the basics, you don't need all that. On your panel, you'll see something like this. This is a 15 amp. This is just a standard 15 amp breaker, right? These are what determines the size of your circuit. So these things are rated for a certain amperage on a certain circuit size. So, for example, this one says 15 on it. So this is a breaker for a 15 amp circuit, a 15 amp 110 volt circuit. It's just a standard circuit breaker that you might use for just a traditional series of outlets like this. Again, you can have on one of these breakers, you can have up to 10 of these outlets wired to it. On a 20 amp, if this was a 20 amp breaker on a 110, these are the outlets that go with it, you could have up to 13 of these plugged into a single breaker. So how this works is on the back here, each panel is a little bit different as far as how these breakers attach to the box itself. This one snaps in here. But again, like I said before, the power has to come in and has to be able to have a closed circuit in order to go somewhere, right? In order to have a closed loop. Power only works in a closed loop. So on the bottom here, there's a little screw, right? So if you think about how a switch works, okay, in order for it to generate power. So say this breaker is on right here. The power would come into the panel. Off that panel, it goes into this clip in the back. This is the conductor where the panel powers this breaker. This breaker will allow up to 15 amps of current to flow through it and out this little screw down here. So you would have a black or a hot wire coming out of here that goes to whatever the circuit powers. So say this was your bedroom outlets, right? They power your nightstands, they power all that stuff. So you'd have a hot wire that comes out of here and it goes to the first receptacle and then continues through all the way back. Your white wires your white and your ground would then come all the way back to the circuit panel, and they have a spot in the panel itself where they attach. So the neutral has a closed loop, so the power goes. If there's a fluctuation in current, say whatever, lightning strikes, you plug too much stuff in, whatever it is, there's a fluctuation in current, draws more than 15 amps, this trips. It's a safety. It keeps you protected, it keeps your house protected, it keeps your appliances protected. If there's any fluctuation in current beyond 15 amps, this shuts it off, right? So 15 amp breaker, 14-2 wiring, 15 amp receptacle. Say this is a 20 amp, it's not, it's 15. Say this is 20 amp, it's 12-2 wiring. Again, 2 conductors, meaning hot, neutral. The ground, they don't count. I don't know why they don't count it. They just don't. So it has 3 wires in it, but it's called 12-2. So 20 amp, this is 20 amp rated wiring, 12-2, 20 amp rated receptacle. Okay, so moving on from there, let's say you're wiring your bathroom, right? You're wanting to wire up the outlets that surround your bathroom, maybe where your hairdryer plugs in, maybe where you plug your electric razors or whatever in. So anywhere that there's water present, and I did a video about this before. It's on my YouTube channel. You guys can check it out if you want. This is called a GFCI, right? And you've seen these before, I'm sure. They have a test and reset button in the middle. This is a 20 amp. Again, remember this little doodad right here that tells you that it's a 20 amp. Or you can read it. It's written on it. So this is a 20 amp receptacle, GFCI. This is an additional safety mechanism. Anywhere that there's water, right? Water and electricity, they're bad. They don't mix. So say you dropped your hairdryer you've seen it a million times, right? People get electrocuted, dropping hairdryers into bathtubs, whatever. In the movies, you see it all the time. Well, that's what these were for. These were built so that these things protect against a surge in current, and they shut the outlet off before it can cause any damage to you. So you have these test and reset buttons. When it trips, it'll snap. The outlet will be dead. You won't be able to use anything in it. You push this button, you reset it, and it works. So anywhere that there's water present, you need one of these. So in your kitchen, check your kitchen. near your sink. Maybe there's a couple outlets by your backsplash. If it's within 6 feet of your sink or a water source, anything that can flood or overflow nearby your toilet, whatever, use one of these. That's what they're for. They're a safety mechanism, 20 amp. Again, this is a tamper resistant one. This is the new code. Tamper resistant has to be involved in all the new codes. So, I know that I'm going a little bit quickly and maybe a lot of information, but if you guys have questions, I will slow down and I will try to answer those questions. So go ahead and do that. Leave me the questions in the comments. How do you determine, Zach Gardner asks, how do you determine the number of lights, outlets, etc. you can have in a run? Okay, so that depends on the circuit and the amperage. This is what I was talking about just a little bit ago. So as I said, a typical, it's an equation that that you have to know. And obviously there's a whole lot of stuff that you can figure out. But the basics is, on a 15 amp circuit, you can have up to, safely, 1,440 watts of draw. Okay, so how that breaks down is like this. So you have a 110/120 volt circuit. Okay, so I'll write it down. So on the higher end, it's 120 volts. Okay, so that's your volts times your amps. So 120 volts times 15 amps. In this instance, that would be for this 15 amp circuit and 120 volt. That's this 110, 120. That's what they're called. They're basically it's 110 or 220 would be the two types of power, but 120, 240 is the same thing. So you do that math, right? That comes out to 1,800 watts, okay? So if you do that math, you figure out how much wattage you can handle. That would make, that determines how many things you can have. So maybe you can't have as many things plugged in as you think. Just look at the draw of what you're using. So if you're lighting, for example, it depends on your bulbs, right? So if you have 100 watt bulbs, you won't be able to have as many on the same run as if they were 75 watt bulbs, if that makes any sense. But safely, the rule of thumb is you never want a circuit to be at 100% load. Okay, that's bad because if it's at 100% load, any fluctuation trips it. Okay, so safely, 80% of that load is what you want on a circuit. So that equals 1,440 watts. Man, I can't line this up with the stupid camera. So 1,440 watts is how much you could basically plug in to a 15 amp breaker. The rule of thumb for these outlets is, what is it? 180 volt amps per outlet. So technically in an 1,800 watt circuit, you could use 10 of these. I mean, that would be at 100% load, but that would mean you'd have to have something plugged into it that draws all that 100% of the time. So it's unlikely that you're going to do that. That's why you can use 10. Oh wait, sorry, that's a 20 amp. I was referencing the wrong thing. But yeah, so if we were to do, for example, if we have 1,440 watts of power in a 15 amp, what would we have in a 20 amp? So again, it's the same basic math. 120 volts times 20 amps. What the heck is that? 120 times 20. God, I can't even think. 2,400 watts? Is that what that is? Yeah. 2,400 watts. I think that math is right. I hope it's right. But anyway, so you can have up to 13 of these 20 amps plugged into the same, plugged into a circuit. So if you're determining an electrical layout, there is standards that you can follow. It's the National Electric Code. If you're going to lay out outlets for a room, you're supposed to lay them out every, put me on the spot, I think it's every, I want to say it's every 6 to 10 feet, but again, I'll have to reference the code as far as what the code is. I forget. But you know, you want them readily accessible around your room. If you have a huge room and you have them spaced out all over the room, you might have to run 2 different circuits of receptacles in the room. But that's just how it works. And then normally, under normal circumstances, you always want your lighting, which is in your ceiling typically, separate on a separate circuit than on your receptacles. You don't want them on one thing. You know, in an older home, you might find that they're on the same circuit. I mean, that's typical. But if you, for example, if you were renovating and you had an electrician come in and was, as part of your renovation, they wanted to do some work, they would change that. That would be something that would end up costing you money if you didn't do it yourself. So think about that. You know, if you have old wiring in your house and you want to have something remodeled and changed, you have to remember that not only do you have to pay for the work that you want, you have to pay for the work to get whatever that room is up to whatever the current code standard is. If you're hiring a licensed contractor and stuff who's doing things by the book, which they should, not even if they are a licensed contractor. If they're they can be a handyman, and if they're not advertising themselves as a licensed contractor, they don't need to be. They can do the work for you, and they can do it as adequately a lot of times, but you want to make sure that they're doing it correctly. So, I hope that answers your question. Let's see. I've got another question here from Michael Walters. Is adding a dedicated 220-volt circuit for a washer, dryer, etc. too tough for the average homeowner? Best left to an electrician or doable? Short answer is absolutely doable. You can do 220-volt circuit yourself, no question. But you have to understand how to do it first, because 220 volts, depending on the amperage, you're talking about well, not for a washer, but for a dryer, it would be for a dryer. That's probably going to be a 30 amp run. 30 amps at 220 volts, if you screw it up, it's going to hurt you real bad. I mean, that can kill you if you screw it up. So understanding what you're doing first is what you need to kind of think of. 110, let me just explain 110 and 220 very quickly. 110 is your typical house outlet for power, okay? It just comes in and you send it out to all these receptacles and things like we've just been talking about. 220 is twice that. It's 2 hot feeds. So imagine, I don't have any examples right here, but imagine a 220 version of this wire would be what's called a 12-3, okay? So there would be 2 hots involved in the same wire. So it would be maybe a black and a red, a white, and a copper. This is only for 20 amps. This wouldn't be for a dryer. This isn't big enough to handle the load. So you'd need probably a 30 amp, which would be a 10 gauge wire would handle 30 amps, or 8 gauge, which would be 40 amps. The amperage rating basically breaks down like this. So for 14 gauge wire, which is this white one here, this can handle up to 15 amps. This is what it's rated for. So in a 15 amp circuit, you use 14.2. In a 12 amp circuit, in a 20 amp circuit, you use 12.2. In a 30 amp circuit, you would use 10 gauge, which is what I ran for a dryer. I've used a dryer that is 30 amps. And then 8 gauge is for 40 amps, which is what I ran for a hot tub that I installed in the back. That's a 40 amp 220. 6 gauge would be for 55 amps, and then it goes up from there. And anything above that, you're starting to mess with very dangerous amount of power. So understanding the principles first, I wouldn't recommend that you start there for sure. I would not recommend that you, like, the first thing you try to do, having never wired anything in your life, is try to run the power for a dryer. It's dangerous. So understanding what the workflow is, and maybe get your feet wet, get shocked a few times at 110 first. And I don't recommend you get shocked, but it happens. Most of the time, if you can, absolutely cut the power at the breaker, or make sure the switches are off wherever you're working, so that if there are switches. But cut the power at the breaker anytime you're working on anything. That's just a general rule to protect yourself, because electrical, people are afraid of it for a reason. It can hurt you real bad. It can kill you if you don't do it right. I would start by wiring up a couple of these. Wire up a couple 15 amp electrical sockets. Kill the power. Take one out, one that's already there. Maybe you have a 2-prong outlet that needs to be updated to a grounded outlet. Maybe it just either was never installed correctly, a previous owner didn't install it right, never attached the ground, or maybe there is no ground and you can ground it to the box. There's any number of things, but practice first on something small. Don't go jumping into 220 right away. If you guys enjoy kind of this live show, later on we can talk a little bit more in detail about 220, and hopefully that will make you a little bit more comfortable. I'm going to plan on doing a little bit more edited type of videos that explain it a lot more clearly than maybe I am doing it right now, because I'm kind of free-balling. I am wearing underwear, but free-balling in the sense of just spitballing is what I was going for. Let's see. I've run a ton of issues with my current home's electric. Trying to figure out the load is very difficult with the manner it is wired, as it is a mix of lights, switches, and outlets. Yeah, that's pretty common. If you live in an old house, you're going to have electrical issues. It's just the way it is. There's a lot of old homes that have old cloth-covered wire, which is kind of this. Now it cracks, it breaks. It's generally unsafe. If you touch it, it can crack and do things, and it's not great. You got to update it, and you can either hire an electrician or you can figure out what's what. But the best way to do it, I think, is to go around and, I guess that kind of segues into another thing I want to talk about, and that is some basic tools as far as what you would need to get started to do your own electrical work. So one of the ones I showed you already is a pair of these. This is just a general pair of wire cutters. These are great because, like I said before, they have the gauges written right here, so you can strip the wires easy. You can cut the wires easy. They're cheap. They're like $5 to $10 for a pair. These things are a necessity if you're going to be doing home electrical work. Definitely get yourself one of these. A couple other tools that I would highly recommend that you get is something like this. So this is I pushed the button, I turned it on. This is a voltage tester. You can see it has a little light on it. So basically, if I touch anything with this end that has live voltage on it, it's going to beep. So I have a power strip. I have an extension cord plugged in right here. And I'm assuming I can get this in here. Maybe not. Yeah. So this is not the best example. Well, this one would. Anyway, if you can get this down in here, it tells you if you have live power. So if voltage is present, and if you're a little skeptical as far as you're not sure if the power is off for an outlet, you're not sure if a wire is live or not, something like this can really help you. Anytime there's voltage present, it does that beep that I just showed you, and it'll beep very quickly if you have something good to plug it into, which I don't happen to have an exposed wire or anything that I can use it on right now. So these things are great. This is Milwaukee makes this one, but there's a million of them out there. You can get these for, again, I think some of them range from like $5 to $20, depending on the brand and the make and what they do. This is another great tool. This kind of does the same thing. This is another voltage tester. This will tell you if an outlet is 110, right, or 220. If you're not sure, 110 or 220, it will tell you what the power draw is. So again, I have the extension cord plugged in here. If I stick this into the leads and I look at it, come on, light up. There it goes. You can kind of see it. It's lit up at 110. If it was 220, it would light up here. So you can't see it too well because there it goes. It's a little bright in here, but this tool, again, another little $5, $10 tool. This thing's great. It's a little voltage tester. If you want to check and make sure if an outlet is live, or you want to test, if something's got power going to it, this is a great way to check. And then this last one, this is another little tool you can get, which is really great. This is a receptacle tester, an outlet tester. And they make GFCI versions of this as well, which tests GFCIs for different issues. So let me show you how this one works. So I've got the same extension cord plugged in here. So this, written on the side there, are some, I guess it's upside down, but are some common mistakes that you would have as far as why your electrical outlets or receptacles, something's wrong with it. It's not working quite right. This one, if it's not wired correctly, will tell you based on where the lights light up. You've got 3 lights here. You've got orange, orange, red. The combinations are written here across. So if you have one orange light, it says it right there in the center, open, whatever that says, open ground. So they're all explained right here. This is a great little tool as well. It can tell you, maybe where you screwed up or what maybe a previous owner has screwed up about it. Sometimes people, like I said, sometimes people mistake hot and neutral. They put the white wire on the bronze terminal and the black wire on the silver terminal and think that's right. It's not. This will tell you that those are reversed. It's wrong. So this will explain that to you. These are great. These, again, I think $5-10. You can get these at any hardware store. Perfect tool for getting started. All these tools all in, you can get all these. You can get a whole kit of stuff like this for $30-40. So I would recommend that if you're going to get started, if you want to kind of try and learn to do some of this stuff on your own, get these 4 tools for sure. The other tools you're going to need are, like your basic screwdrivers, maybe a drill or whatever if you don't already have one. But those are the basics. And then again, safety glasses, that kind of thing. All that stuff kind of goes hand in hand with all this. And then there's a lot of books out there. So going back to a previous question, if we talk about getting started, you want to install the power on a 220 dryer, right? Consult some of these. These are great manuals. This one is Advanced Home Wiring. I have another one also that I've loaned to a friend of mine, which is more of a home wiring basics book. This one's great, very illustrated, tells you everything you can need to know, combinations of wiring, 3-way switches, all sorts of stuff. It's different. This is up to date. This is for the 2014 current codes. So this is an advanced wiring book. You can get those on Amazon, anywhere. I mean, they're great just to have as reference in case you have any questions. They're really well illustrated and they make things a lot easier. Sorry, let me scroll back in a couple of these questions. I'm probably only going to talk about this stuff for maybe another 10 minutes or so. I don't want to let this linger on too long. I just wanted to discuss some of the basics of home wiring, and then we can delve into some of the more advanced stuff later on down the road. And like I said, I'll do a little bit more videos on basics of wiring your own things and illustrating. Watch my other GFCI video if you want to learn how to install a GFCI from scratch. And I'll do some more circuitry type install videos as well. Mark says, what college did you go to learn all these electrical basics? I didn't. I went to college. I didn't go to college for this. This is stuff that I've learned over the years, and that I learned from my dad, and doing a lot of DIY work and residential and home repair stuff on my own, and a lot of research and a lot of self teaching. That's what this is all from. Let's see. Why is 230 volt the standard for households in the UK but 110 in America? I don't know, to be honest with you. That's why I was mentioning at the beginning of this episode that this is for the United States specific. This is the National Electric Code for the United States. I don't know why they do things the way they do in the UK. I haven't really done much background research into that. Let's see. Doing a great job. Would love to try and make a small model for the next video for the newbies. I agree. I want to try and get these videos as basic and as informative as I possibly can. I understand that people are visual learners, so I'm trying to use as many models and things that I possibly can. One thing that I forgot to mention previously that I just want to touch on briefly and just show you guys an example of. This is a metal box. This is called a junction box. And what a junction box is anywhere. So say you had two sets of wires that came together somewhere in your house, and you needed to tie them together, right? Anything like that, you wouldn't tie these two together necessarily because they're different circuits. But anything on the same circuit that you would be tying together needs to be enclosed in a junction box. Now, they make these in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and depths. This is a bigger one. This is a 4-inch box. But any junctions between wires, so say you have wire nuts, right? You have your wires are twisted together. You know, you put a wire nut on here. You can't leave this exposed like this. Well, I wouldn't do that. So these two neutral wires. So say you had these two neutral wires combined. You can't leave this exposed in a wall like that. It has to be inside something like this. This is a junction box. And the way these work is very simple. So you mount them to wherever they need to go. And you can use a screwdriver, for example, and you punch out. They have different gauge punch outs. So you just punch out one of these metal caps here, and they just snap off. They're scored. And then they have wire connectors, which I should have some here somewhere. Well, I don't know where they are, but I apologize. So there's a little threaded insert that goes in here that clamps. The wire would go in like this. Well, not that way. The wire would go in like this. It would clamp into here so that the wire can't move, so it can't be pulled in and out. You would cut all this back with your razor blade, peel it back, get rid of the insulation and the wiring, or the paper that's inside, tie your wires together, and then you would close the whole thing up with a cover. There's a cover plate that just goes on like that. You tighten it down. That keeps all your electrical connections enclosed so that nobody can hurt themselves if they open up a wall or something. So if you find one of these somewhere in your house, that means it's an electrical junction box. It means there's a combination of electrical wires tied together inside of here. Like I said, they make them in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and stuff, depending on what you're working on. Oh, let's see. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll through a couple more questions here. Is there any reason not to use the insert on the back of an outlet as opposed to the screw terminals? Okay, that's actually a really good question. So there are different outlets out there nowadays as far as how you actually attach the wires to the terminals. So on the back of this outlet, as an example, there are little holes that you can see. Now, these do the same thing as these. They allow you to slide the wire directly in, and it snaps into place. Okay? Same thing on the hot side. Now, the other option would be to do it the more traditional route, which would be to wrap it around the terminals. So these are the terminal screws. So say you were to wire up this outlet, for example. This is a 12 gauge wire. So I take my wire strippers, I cut it back a little bit. Now, a common mistake that people make when wiring an outlet is they cut way too much of this back, okay? They cut it way back here, then they'll wrap it around and think that it's good. If an electrical inspector comes in and looks at that, he's going to tell you to redo it. And if you have cut the wires too short in the box and you don't have enough room to cut it back and redo it, you're going to be screwed. So you don't want to cut back a ton of this, okay? You want to just do enough so that if you had a pair of needle nose pliers, you can use that, or you can use your wire strippers on the end. You can just twist it. So I'll grab the end of the wire like this and twist it, okay? Now this would be a traditional way to install it. You wrap it around the terminal like that, and then use your screwdriver and you tighten this down. Now you wrap the wire around the terminal in the direction of the way that it tightens. That means that you'll have a secure fit, right? So you don't want a bunch of extra exposed wire here, because sometimes you'll push the wiring back into the box. These wires can get close together. If they get close together and they're not insulated, they're going to arc. That's potentially cause a fire. They could arc to the box itself. They could, if it's a metal box, it depends. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you cut back too much of this wire. So make sure that you only cut back enough that you need. And if you're going to wrap them around the terminals like that, make sure that you wrap them around clockwise so that when you tighten it, it will pull it in tight. So that's a basic one. I'm just going to rehash a couple quick things before we wrap things up. Again, so we talked about the basics of home electrical, and most circuitry in your house is either 110/120 volt or 220 volt, 220 to 240. Windows in those two ranges. 220 is for big appliances, dryers, ranges, things like that. 110 is for smaller things, just plugging in, fans, all that kind of stuff, whatever, chargers, that kind of thing. So know the difference between 220 and 110 and what their receptacles look like. Again, this is a GFCI. GFCI stands for ground fault circuit interrupter. This goes anywhere near water goes. You can identify a 20 amp by this little sidebar that sticks out of the outlet there. A 15 amp looks just like this. Just your traditional 3-prong outlet. We talked about the gauges of wiring and what their uses are. And we talked about some tools that you could use to get started. My phone's blowing up. And what else did we talk about? We talked about how to determine load, right? We talked about what voltage and amperage are. We used our pipe example. We've got the force at which, for example, electrons are moving through a pipe or a wire. That's your volt. The volume is basically your amperage, okay? So we talked about current. We talked about breakers. We talked about junction boxes. We talked about identifying what watts are. Watts are volts times amps, right? So volts, 120 volts times 15 amps, 1800 watts, 10 outlets, 10 receptacles per circuit. 20 amps times 20 amps, or 20 amps times 120 volts, 2400 watts. You can add some more outlets to that circuit. Okay, make sure you put 20 amp circuits in your bathrooms. Make sure your lighting and your your GFCIs and all that stuff in your bathrooms are 20 amp because those are higher draw areas. And then the rest we can discuss in further detail later on down the road. I want to thank you guys so much for checking in and tuning in for another live show. I enjoy doing these, and I will do my best to try and make them as glitch-free and problem-free as I can moving forward, and as informative and interactive as I possibly can, and incorporate your guys' comments and questions as much as possible. In the meantime, before I do the next one, I think I'll do the next one 2 weeks from today, which is November something on a Wednesday, same time. And I appreciate you guys coming by. In the meantime, make sure you check out some of my other videos on my channel if you want to learn some other stuff or check out some of the projects that I build. And until then, thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks for your questions. And I will catch you guys later. All right, guys, so this is what we're working on today. We're going to fix this crappy wiring. There's so much wrong with this, it's not even funny. It's just a Romex piece coming straight out of the wall, runs down exterior wall here, goes back into this round receptacle. On top of that, they've got a regular, not GFCI outlet that just is crooked in the box, and then they've just gone and slapped that box to the side of this paneling that was here before I tore it all out because it was infested with termites.